The year was 2147, and Earth had finally made it to the big table, well, sort of. For the past 20 years, humanity had been sitting quietly in the back row of the Galactic Concordance Council, a group of 7 alien civilizations that had been keeping peace across the stars long before humans even figured out how to leave their own planet. They called it observer status, which really just meant, you can watch but don't touch anything. The council met on a massive space station called Harmony Prime, floating peacefully near Jupiter's orbit. It wasn't made of steel or glass like human stations, more like living coral fused with light, breathing gently in the vacuum. Everything about it whispered calm, order, and ancient wisdom. Humans, by contrast, still argued over coffee rations and forgot to mute their comms during meetings. One person who'd spent more time on Harmony Prime than on Earth was a quiet scientist who dedicated her life to understanding not just alien languages, but the unspoken rules behind them, the pauses, the gestures, the way silence could carry more weight than words. She'd learned early on that the council didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their decisions landed like slow-moving glaciers, inevitable, quiet, and impossible to stop once set in motion. That day started like any other. Soft chimes echoed through the curved halls as delegates from different species gathered in the grand chamber. A dome opened to the stars, where Jupiter loomed like a silent judge in the distance. The topic on the agenda was Mars. Again. For years, Earth had been working to make Mars livable, not just for survival, but because billions of people back home were running out of time. Rising seas, poisoned rivers, air too thick to breathe in half the cities. It wasn't science fiction anymore. It was Tuesday. Terraforming Mars wasn't a dream, it was a lifeline. But the council saw it differently. To them, Mars was a pristine dead world, and altering it, even to save a species, violated the Prime Equilibrium Accord, a rule, written centuries ago after a well-meaning civilization accidentally wiped out an entire ecosystem by helping it evolve. The council believed in non-interference above all. Let planets be. Let life find its own way, even if that way led to extinction. The lead human diplomat, a man who'd spent his career trying to speak the council's language of restraint, stood calmly as the verdict came down. Cease all terraforming operations within 30 cycles, the Veln representative intoned, their voice like wind through crystal. Failure to comply will result in full energy sanctions. Your solar grids will go dark. That wasn't just a threat. It was a death sentence. Without the council's zero-point energy relays, Earth's fragile recovery systems would collapse. Hospitals would shut down. Water purifiers would stop. Millions would die, not from war or plague, but from the sudden absence of light. The room fell silent. Every alien delegate watched the humans, waiting for the usual response. Apology, negotiation, compromise. That's what observers did. But this time, something shifted. The human delegation didn't argue. They didn't beg. Instead, their leader stepped forward, placed a small data crystal on the central pedestal, the official symbol of membership, and said simply, "We withdraw." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Withdrawal wasn't just rare, it was unheard of. No species had ever walked away from the council once invited, even as observers. To leave was to choose isolation, to choose uncertainty, to choose being alone in a universe that had already decided you didn't belong. As the humans boarded their shuttle for the trip back to Earth, the scientist looked out the viewport one last time. Harmony Prime glowed softly against the black, beautiful and cold. She expected to feel fear or regret. Instead, she felt something unexpected. Relief. Like a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had finally lifted. Because, here's the thing no one talked about, the council's peace came at a cost. It demanded conformity. It asked species to shrink themselves, to mute their instincts, to wait patiently while their worlds burned. Humanity had spent 20 years trying to fit into that mold, softening their voices, hiding their urgency, pretending their pain wasn't screaming louder than any star. But you can't save a drowning person by teaching them to breathe underwater. Sometimes you just have to pull them out, even if it breaks the rules. The shuttle engines hummed to life, pushing them away from the station, away from the only interstellar community they'd ever known. Below them, Jupiter's storm swirled in silence. Ahead, Earth hung in the distance, a blue-green marble wrapped in clouds, fragile and furious with life. Back home, no one was waiting with fanfare. There were no parades, just worried faces. On news feeds, confused citizens and governments scrambling to respond. The withdrawal was already being called the Great Silence by commentators. Because overnight, Earth had gone from connected to cut off. No more shared tech, no more deep space navigation data, no more warnings about solar flares or rogue asteroids. But in the quiet that followed, something else began to stir. In labs, engineers started re-examining old designs they'd shelved because the council deemed them too aggressive. In schools, teachers stopped teaching that the council's way was the only way. Artists painted murals of Mars not as a red desert, but as a world waking up. Green shoots pushing through rust-colored soil, domes glowing under twin suns. And in a small apartment overlooking a city still learning to breathe clean air, the scientist opened a private journal. She didn't write about politics or sanctions. She wrote about a memory. Her grandmother planting seeds in cracked earth during the last great drought, saying, "Just because the world's broken doesn't mean we stop trying to grow things." That was the heart of it, wasn't it? The council saw balance as stillness, but humans had always known. Life isn't still. It fights, it adapts, it reaches. Leaving the council hadn't been an act of rebellion. It had been an act of honesty. They couldn't pretend anymore that waiting was the same as wisdom, that silence was the same as peace. As night fell over the city, lights flickered, not from power loss, but from millions of people turning on lamps, charging devices, heating meals. Life, stubborn and bright, going on. And somewhere out there in the endless dark between stars, the universe watched. Not with judgment, not with approval, just watching. Because the truth was, no one knew what came next. Not the council, not Earth, not even the scientist who'd spent her life trying to translate the cosmos. But for the first time in a long time, humanity wasn't asking for permission to find out. Back on Earth, the silence hit harder than anyone expected. It wasn't just the loss of alien tech or faster-than-light comms. It was the feeling of being watched no more. For 20 years, humanity had known that somewhere out there, older, wiser civilizations were keeping an eye on them, like teachers grading a student's progress. Now the classroom was empty. The report card had been torn up, and Earth was alone with its own choices. At first, panic spread like wildfire. Stock markets tumbled. Power grids flickered as energy-sharing networks with off-world partners shut down. In some cities, streetlights went dark for whole nights. People whispered in hushed tones, "Did we just doom ourselves?" But then something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing, communities started pulling together. Neighbors who'd never spoken before began sharing solar batteries. Farmers opened their greenhouses to city kids who'd never seen real soil. Engineers who'd spent years adapting alien designs now turned their focus inward, building simpler, sturdier systems that didn't rely on off-world parts. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it was theirs. The scientist who'd been on Harmony Prime found herself pulled into a new role, not as a translator of alien tongues, but as a keeper of human truth. She was invited to join a small, unofficial group called the Earth Continuity Initiative. No fancy title, no uniforms, just thinkers, builders, healers, and dreamers meeting in basements, rooftops, and old subway tunnels, asking one question over and over. Now that no one's watching, who do we want to be? One rainy afternoon, while sorting through decades of archived council logs, data they'd wisely backed up before the split, she stumbled on something strange. Buried deep in diplomatic records was a file labeled Veln Seating Protocol, classified. Curious, she opened it. What she found turned everything upside down. The Veln, the calm, rule-following leaders of the council, hadn't always been passive observers. Centuries ago, they'd traveled to lifeless planets and seeded them with microbes, hoping to spark new ecosystems. But when those young worlds struggled, when storms raged too hard or atmospheres collapsed, they never returned. They believed interference would corrupt the natural path, even if that path led to total extinction. In one log, a Veln scientist wrote, "We gave them the spark. What they do with it is not ours to shape." The scientist reading this felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. That wasn't wisdom, it was abandonment dressed up as principle. And suddenly, humanity's so-called violation made perfect sense. While the council watched from a distance, humans had done the messy, risky, deeply human thing. They'd tried to help. On Mars, they didn't just drop microbes and leave. They monitored soil chemistry, adjusted atmospheric pressure, shielded newborn lichens from radiation. They stayed. They cared. That wasn't breaking the rules. That was rewriting them. She brought the discovery to the group. At first, there was disbelief. Then anger. Then slowly pride. "We weren't wrong," someone said, voice trembling. "We were just different." And that difference mattered. Across the planet, a quiet shift began. People stopped apologizing for being too emotional, too impatient, or too loud. Artists painted murals of hands planting trees on red deserts. Musicians wrote songs about fixing broken things instead of leaving them alone. Even children's stories changed. No longer about waiting for saviors from the stars, but about building life with your own two hands. The scientists started giving talks not in grand halls, but in community centers and schoolyards. She didn't speak about aliens or treaties. She spoke about gardens. "Every time you plant a seed in dry ground," she'd say, "you're saying, 'I believe tomorrow can be better.' That's not arrogance. That's hope with calloused hands." Governments, once paralyzed by fear of council judgment, began making bold moves. They redirected resources from defense to restoration. Old desalination plants were revived. Rooftop farms spread like vines across cities. And Mars' work didn't stop, it accelerated. Not with secret shame, but with open pride. What if, someone proposed at a global summit, instead of hiding our efforts, we share them? Not to prove we're right, but to say, this is how we care. So Earth did something radical. They opened their terraforming data to anyone who asked, even rival nations, even former enemies. No patents, no paywalls, just raw, honest science. Here's what worked. Here's what failed. Try it. Improve it. It wasn't perfect. Mistakes were made. Some crops died. Some domes cracked under pressure. But every failure was logged, studied, and shared. And with each lesson, humanity grew not just smarter, but kinder, to each other, and to the worlds they touched. Meanwhile, deep in space, the silence from the council remained. No messages, no warnings, no judgment, just absence. And in that absence, something beautiful grew. Freedom. Freedom to fail. Freedom to try again. Freedom to define their own values without looking over their shoulder. One evening, the scientists stood on a hill outside a rebuilt coastal town. The air smelled of salt and blooming night jasmine. Below, solar lanterns glowed in windows. Kids laughed as they chased bioluminescent drones shaped like fireflies. Another homegrown invention, made from recycled comms gear. She thought about Harmony Prime, floating in the dark, so perfect and still. And she realized the council hadn't exiled humanity. Humanity had outgrown the need for permission. The cosmos wasn't a classroom with a single right answer. It was a garden, wild, unpredictable, and full of life that refused to stay in its lane. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what the universe needed. Not perfect order, but stubborn, messy, relentless care. Back in the city, a new broadcast was being prepared, not for the council, but for anyone listening, human or otherwise. It would carry soil samples from Earth, music from every continent, and a simple message. We're learning. We're trying. And we won't look away when something's hurting. No one knew if anyone would hear it. But for the first time in a long time, that didn't matter, because Earth wasn't speaking to be approved. It was speaking to be true. And in the quiet hum of a planet healing itself, that truth was louder than any star. With the council gone and Earth finally breathing on its own terms, people didn't just rebuild, they reimagined. The old dream of space travel had always been about escape. Get off a dying planet, find a new one, start over. But now something deeper took root. What if going to the stars wasn't about running away, but about reaching out? That idea became Project Diaspora. Not a military mission, not a race for resources, but a quiet act of offering. 3 ships were built. not with weapons or mining drills, but with libraries of seeds, coral polyps, soil microbes, and recordings of whale songs, children's laughter, and rain on rooftops. Each ship carried a simple promise: we come not to take, but to tend. The scientist who'd once translated alien silence now helped design what these ships would say to the universe. No demands, no claims of ownership, just data, open, honest, and free. If a world was dying, Earth would send tools to help it heal. If life was struggling to begin, they'd offer a gentle nudge. And if a planet was truly empty, they'd leave it be. This wasn't about spreading humanity, it was about sharing care. One of those ships was called the Aurora. It wasn't shiny or grand. Its hull was patched with recycled orbital debris, its engines humming with repurposed Veln tech they'd studied for years but never fully understood. Until now. Engineers had taken apart every piece, not to copy, but to learn. And in doing so, they'd made something new. Slower, less efficient by council standards, but deeply human. It carried mistakes, fixes, and handwritten notes in the margins of its code. The scientist volunteered to go, not as a leader, not as a hero, just as someone who believed words mattered even in the void. She packed light, a journal, a vial of soil from her childhood home, and a small speaker that played lullabies from 100 cultures. She didn't expect to meet anyone out there. She just wanted to be there when the first seed hit alien ground. Launch day wasn't like the old rocket shows with crowds and countdowns. There were no flags waving, no speeches about conquest. Just a quiet gathering at the equatorial spaceport, where families hugged their loved ones goodbye under a sky still healing from centuries of smoke. Some cried. Some smiled. Most just held hands and watched as the Aurora rose, not with a roar, but with a low, steady hum, like a heartbeat leaving home. As the ship cleared the atmosphere, Earth shrank behind them, blue, bruised, beautiful. The crew didn't cheer. They sat in silence, watching their world fade into a speck of light. One of them whispered, "We're not leaving it behind. We're carrying it with us." Their destination was Epsilon Indy 4, a cold, methane-rich world orbiting a sun older than Earth. Scans showed it once had oceans, now frozen under miles of ice. Its atmosphere was thinning. Its core was cooling. By council standards, it was beyond recovery. But Earth had learned to look past labels like that. After all, Mars had been called dead too. The journey would take 12 years. Time enough to grow food in hydroponic bays, to teach each other forgotten songs, to watch stars no human eye had ever seen. Time enough to wonder, will anyone even notice we came? But that wasn't the point. Halfway through the voyage, the crew made a decision. Before they even arrived, they'd send a message. Not to any government, not to any species, just into the open dark. It would contain everything. Their mission logs, their failures on Mars, their reasons for leaving the council, and a simple question. What if care is the highest law? They debated the wording for days. Should it be formal? Poetic, scientific? In the end, they kept it raw. No polish, no performance. Just truth spoken plainly, like a neighbor knocking on your door at midnight with soup and a listening ear. When they finally transmitted it, there was no fanfare. Just a soft chime as the signal pulsed outward at light speed, riding on waves of hope with no guarantee of reply. Months later, as the Aurora drifted through the silent lanes between stars, something strange happened. A faint echo returned, not from Epsilon Indy, but from a completely different direction. At first they thought it was static. But when they cleaned the signal, they found patterns. Not language, not music, but something older. A data stream, broken and ancient, repeating the same sequence over and over. It took weeks to decode. What they found wasn't a warning or a welcome. It was a memory from a civilization long gone called the Jara. In their own fragmented records came a final archive. They'd once tried to heal dying worlds too. They'd sent ships like the Aurora, full of life and hope. But the galaxy wasn't ready. Other species called them reckless, dangerous, interferers. They were shunned, then forgotten. Their last transmission, sent just before their star went dark, read, "The Council fears change, but life is change. You are not alone in choosing to tend the garden." The crew sat in stunned silence. They weren't the first, and maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't be the last. That night, the scientist wrote in her journal, "We thought we were shouting into the void, but the void has been listening all along. It just needed someone brave enough to speak kindly." When the Aurora finally reached Epsilon Indi IV, the planet looked even more broken up close. Methane storms howled across frozen plains. The ice caps glowed faintly under the dim red sun. It felt lonely, but they didn't hesitate. They released the first bioscaffold, a web of self-replicating algae designed to feed on methane and slowly thicken the air. Then came the lichen spores, tough little survivors that could cling to ice and whisper oxygen into the wind. Finally, they planted a single seed pod in a sheltered crater, warmed by geothermal vents they'd mapped from orbit. It might take centuries to grow. It might fail completely. But they did it anyway. And as the Aurora prepared to leave, its mission complete, its cargo spent, the scientist stood at the viewport one last time. She didn't say goodbye. She whispered, "Grow well." Back on the ship, they turned not toward home, but toward the next signal on their map, a faint thermal bloom on a moon orbiting a distant gas giant. Another world whispering for help, because now they understood. The cosmos wasn't a place to be ruled or observed. It was a place to be loved, carefully, patiently, without expecting anything in return. And that, more than any treaty or technology, was what made them truly human. Years passed like slow breaths in the deep quiet of space. The Aurora drifted farther from home than any human vessel had ever gone, its hull scarred by micrometeorites, its systems patched with ingenuity and hope. Inside, the crew had settled into a rhythm, not of duty but of purpose. They weren't explorers in the old sense, chasing flags or first footprints. They were gardeners, carrying life in their hands like fragile gifts. When they finally reached Epsilon Indi IV, the planet looked even more broken up close. Methane storms howled across frozen plains. The ice caps glowed faintly under the dim red sun. It felt lonely, but they didn't hesitate. They released the first bioscaffold, a web of self-replicating algae designed to feed on methane and slowly thicken the air. Then came the lichen spores, tough little survivors that could cling to ice and whisper oxygen into the wind. Finally, they planted a single seed pod in a sheltered crater, warmed by geothermal vents they'd mapped from orbit. It might take centuries to grow. It might fail completely, but they did it anyway. And as the Aurora prepared to leave, its mission complete, its cargo spent, the scientist stood at the viewport one last time. She didn't say goodbye. She whispered, "Grow well." Back on the ship, they turned not toward home, but toward the next signal on their map, a faint thermal bloom on a moon orbiting a distant gas giant. Another world whispering for help, because now they understood. The cosmos wasn't a place to be ruled or observed. It was a place to be loved carefully, patiently, without expecting anything in return. And that, more than any treaty or technology, was what made them truly human. But just as they began their long cruise toward the next destination, something unexpected happened. A signal pulsed through the ship's comms, not on any known frequency. Not from Earth, not from any council channel. It was faint, buried under cosmic noise, but unmistakably artificial. The crew gathered around the main display, hearts pounding not with fear but with a quiet kind of awe. It wasn't a message meant for them. Not exactly. It was a broadcast, old, fragmented, repeating in loops like a lighthouse calling through fog. They ran it through every decoder they had. At first it looked like static. Then patterns emerged. Mathematical sequences, star maps, biological signatures, and beneath it all a rhythm that felt familiar like a heartbeat. Days of work followed. Sleep was forgotten. Meals were eaten cold. Slowly, painstakingly, they pieced together the truth. This wasn't Velen, it wasn't human. It was something older. So old the language had no words left, only echoes. They called it the Jara Archive. From what they could reconstruct, the Jara had been a species of healers. Not warriors, not traders, not empire builders, but tenders of worlds. They'd traveled the galaxy long before the Council existed, reviving dying ecosystems, coaxing life from barren rock, stitching broken biospheres back together with threads of care, but their ways clashed with rising powers who saw nature as something to control, not nurture. They were called reckless, naive, dangerous. In the end, they vanished, not in war but in silence. Their last act wasn't a battle cry but a final broadcast, a library of everything they'd learned, sent into the void like seeds on the wind. And now, centuries later, it had found the Aurora. The crew sat in stunned silence as the full archive loaded. It contained blueprints for atmospheric stabilizers, genetic templates for extremophile plants, even recordings of Jara songs. Haunting, wordless melodies that seemed to hum with the pulse of living planets. But the most powerful part was their final log, translated through layers of guesswork and empathy. We tried to show them that balance isn't stillness. It's movement. It's repair. It's showing up when things are broken. The Council fears change. But life is change. You are not alone in choosing to tend the garden. Tears welled in more than one pair of eyes. Not because they were sad, but because they finally understood. They weren't the first to walk this path. They were part of a lineage. A quiet, scattered family of caretakers stretching across time and stars. That night, the scientist wrote in her journal, "We thought we were shouting into the void. But the void has been listening all along. It just needed someone brave enough to speak kindly." The discovery changed everything. It wasn't just about Mars or Epsilon Indi anymore. It was about legacy, about proving that kindness could be a cosmic force, not weak, but resilient. Not naive, but necessary. They decided to do something new. Instead of just delivering life, they'd become messengers. They embedded the Jara archive into their own broadcasts, adding their human stories beside it, photos of rooftop gardens in flooded cities, audio of kids singing while planting trees, logs of failed experiments and hard-won lessons. They called it the Continuum Transmission. Then they sent it out, not aimed at anyone, just released into the flow of space like dropping a bottle in an endless ocean. Weeks later, as the Aurora approached its next target, a moon with subsurface oceans slowly freezing shut, they received another signal. Fainter this time, not data, just a single pulse, then another, then a pattern. It matched the rhythm of their own heartbeat monitors. Someone or something was listening and responding. They didn't know who. Maybe another lost species, maybe a machine left behind by the Jara, maybe just the universe echoing back what it had been given. It didn't matter. What mattered was the choice they'd made, to care openly, without shame. To believe that healing was worth the risk, to trust that even in a vast, silent cosmos, kindness could ripple farther than fear. As the Aurora descended toward the icy moon, its landing struts unfolding like gentle hands, the crew felt no fear. Only readiness, because they weren't just carrying Earth with them anymore. They were carrying a promise, one made not just by humans, but by every being who ever chose to mend instead of conquer, to stay instead of walk away. And out there, in the dark between stars, that promise was starting to bloom. Decades had passed since the day humanity walked away from the Council. Back on Earth, the world had changed, not with flashy miracles, but with quiet, stubborn acts of care. Mars was no longer just a red dot in the sky. It was home to forests of genetically adapted pines, their needles shimmering copper in the thin sunlight. Cities floated above rising oceans on platforms grown from recycled plastic and coral. Children learned in schools built inside repurposed cargo ships, studying not just math and history, but how to listen to the wind, the soil, the silence between heartbeats. The scientist who once stood on Harmony Prime watching Jupiter swirl in judgment now moved slowly through Earth's rebuilt gardens, her hair silver, her hands rough from planting. She rarely spoke in public anymore, but when she did, people listened, not because she held power, but because she carried truth like a seed in her pocket, ready to offer it without asking for anything back. Then, one ordinary morning, the sky changed. Telescopes picked it up first, tiny glints of light where no ships should be. Not one, not 10 dozens, then hundreds, a fleet, but unlike any war armada from old movies. These vessels didn't gleam with weapons or sharp edges. They curved like shells, pulsed with soft bioluminescence, drifted like leaves on a cosmic breeze. They weren't vellum, they weren't human. They were something else entirely. Some familiar from old star charts, others completely unknown. Panic flickered for a moment. Old fears rose. Are they here to punish us? To finish what the Council started? But then came the signal, not a demand, not a warning. Just a simple, repeating pulse. gentle, rhythmic, matching the frequency Earth had used in its continuum transmissions. And attached to it, data. Not weapons schematics or territorial claims, but genetic archives. Atmospheric models. Cryopreserved spores from dying worlds. Pleas wrapped in science sent across light years like outstretched hands. They weren't invaders. They were refugees, survivors, gardeners like Earth had become. The scientists stood on a hill overlooking the main spaceport as the first alien vessel requested docking clearance. No one argued. No one demanded proof or payment. The reply was sent within minutes. You don't need permission to care. Dock at Bay 7. What followed wasn't a summit or a treaty signing. It was something far more human. At Bay 7, engineers met engineers, not with translators, but with shared diagrams drawn in the air using light pens. Biologists exchanged soil samples in glass vials, pointing at microbes with wonder, not suspicion. A being with skin like bark and eyes like liquid amber gently placed a seed the size of a fist into the hands of a young Earth botanist. The kid didn't speak their language, but they understood the gesture. This is all I have left. Please help it live. No one asked where these visitors came from. No one demanded they join a new council or follow new rules. Instead, Earth offered what it had learned. Not perfection, but practice. Not answers, but willingness. In the weeks that followed, the spaceport became a living mosaic. Tents bloomed beside docking bays filled with shared meals. Some cooked over open flames, others warmed by bioluminescent fungi. Music drifted through the air, flutes made of bone, drums that hummed with magnetic fields, and human voices singing old folk songs about rivers and rain. Language barriers didn't stop connection. They deepened it. People learned to speak with hands, with eyes, with the quiet space between words. The scientist watched it all from a distance, heart full. She remembered the cold silence of Harmony Prime, the weight of being judged for caring too much. Now here in this messy, joyful gathering, care wasn't a flaw, it was the bridge. One evening, as twin moons rose over the port, a group gathered around a fire made from reclaimed ship plating. An elder from a water-world species, their skin shimmering with moisture, spoke through a simple voice modulator. We heard your signal. We thought it was a dream, no one. Helps without wanting something. A human farmer, hands still stained with Martian soil, replied, We used to think that too. Then we realized helping is the something. Laughter rose, not mocking, but relieved. Like a knot finally undone. Back on Earth, cities buzzed, not with fear, but with purpose. Schools added new subjects. Interspecies botany, cosmic ethics, the art of listening across silence. Kids built model ships not to conquer, but to carry. And on Mars, the first joint greenhouse opened. Its walls grown from Earth lichen and alien mycelium. Its air a blend of two worlds breathing together. The scientist often visited that greenhouse. She'd sit on a bench made of recycled hull metal and watch tiny green shoots push through soil that had once been dust on a dead planet. She'd think about the day humanity left the council, the day they thought they'd lost the cosmos, but they hadn't lost it. They'd found it because the universe wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't a marketplace. It was a garden, vast, wild, and full of broken places waiting for someone to kneel down and say, Let me try. And now they weren't alone in trying. Years later, when the first child born on Mars, human but with eyes that held the red dust of two worlds, asked how Earth became part of the stars, the old scientist would smile and say, We didn't join them. We showed up with open hands and dirty knees, and the cosmos welcomed us not because we were perfect, but because we cared enough to stay. No grand speeches, no monuments. Just life growing quietly in the cracks of what was broken, and in the end that was enough. More than enough. Because the day humanity left the council wasn't the end of their story. It was the day the cosmos finally began.